Hey guys, it's Bray here at Blossom and Branch Farm, and today I'm going to talk about how you can fix your native soil to make it more amenable to growing without having to buy a lot of extra amendments or build expensive raised beds. I hear this one all the time because I often talk about how consumerism has overtaken gardening. Gardening is a $133 billion industry. There are a lot of vested interests out there trying to get you to buy things that you don't necessarily need. There are so many misconceptions about clay soils, sandy soils, and how, oh, I can't grow in that soil. Instead, I have to buy in these bags of soil, which honestly half the time are worse than what you actually have in the ground. And it becomes this expensive, earth-draining proposition to start a garden because it takes all these resources and inputs and shipping soil and the manufacture of that and the plastic bags and all this stuff, and it's not needed most of the time. I absolutely understand and recognize that there are situations when raised beds are needed. For example, if you live on a granite rock, or if you have very contaminated soils with lead or arsenic, or if you have mobility issues, you totally get that. But for most of us, the soil that we have in the ground is totally fine for growing in. Now, I get a lot of questions about where I am. If you're new to the channel, I am in Colorado. We are zone 5-6. I have very heavy clay. When we moved into this property, not only did we have clay, but we had compacted clay. So the farm property was about to be turned into townhomes before we were able to purchase it, and it had been driven over, surveyed, driven huge trucks on here that had dumpsters here, and it was very, very hard pan. My first year, I did buy in compost. I bought in the best compost I possibly could, and I spread it. So half of our field was established that way. Now the other half of the field, I established those beds in a different way. And the reason that I changed my process was because once I was running soils tests on the side of the field where I had amended mostly with compost, I found that I had really very high phosphorus and salt levels, which explained why a lot of my plants were suffering. And this is very common. If you're buying in bagged compost or even a lot of bagged soils, is that they can be high in salt, they can be high in phosphorus, and this can build up in soil. Phosphorus tends to really accumulate. It's not one that leaches quickly from soil like nitrogen. Looked at those soils tests and I said, okay, I need to come up with a different way, a cheaper way to establish the rest of the farm. So I'm going to talk you through how we do that now and how it's cheaper and how it's actually better for the soil life. So the problem that we often have and that I often hear is, oh, I have clay or I have sandy soil. Now both of those soils have the same problem, which is that they're lacking in organic matter. They need more organic matter. Clay needs more organic matter because that's going to help aerate it. It's going to help create chunks and little bits and airflow for a lot of those more aerobic microbes and soil life to be able to survive. If the soil is too compacted and heavy, a lot of the microbial life that we want to see in the soil isn't able to survive. If we can increase the organic matter level in sandy soil, it helps with water and nutrient retention. And if we can increase the amount of organic matter in clay soil, it's going to help with aeration and also just boosting that amount of organic matter, which is going to make the soil spongier and less compacted. But how do we do that? So here's what I do. This process for me starts in the fall. And in the fall, we put out a call to all of our neighbors. We say, hey, bring all your leaves to us. We will take them. We take everybody's bagged leaves. Now we do tell people, please no treated leaves from, for example, we have ash borer here, so some people will spray their trees. So we say, please don't give us those leaves if you've treated your trees with anything. And they bring them, we keep the bags here, and then I spread those leaves out over our garden beds in the fall. So that does two things. One is it helps out a little organic matter, even over the winter as those things are getting wet and they'll start to break down on top of the soil. So we get some nice organic matter there over the winter, but also it's helping protect the soil. It's helping to keep the moisture regulated. It's helping to keep the temperatures regulated. So we're not getting a lot of temperature fluctuations, which can be bad for the soil life. In the fall, we apply those leaves. Now in the spring, before I'm getting ready to cover crop, that's when I pull back those leaves. So I'm just going to rake them off. I just set them to the side into the walkways. Now I leave it in the walkways. We're going to put a little bit back on at the end and you'll see that, but I leave the rest in the walkways just to break down and to serve as a weed barrier during the growing season. So in a way I'm composting in place, and then in the next year I can scoop it up out of the walkways and put it on the beds. So in the spring we've raked back our leaves. So now what I like to do is I like to go through with a broad fork. Now if you have clay soil, this is going to be a great thing for you to do. Sandy soil might not benefit from broad fork quite as much because you already have pretty aerated soil, but If you are going to be applying any compost, a broadfork can help work it down a little bit into the soil without all of the disturbance from tillage. If you really feel you need to till, it is, in my book, okay. All right, it's not the end of the world if you have to till, especially the first time, to establish your garden. If you have clay soil, you'll understand. Sometimes you cannot get into that soil, at least for the first year or two, until you've put a lot of organic matter on it. And if you're looking to start a garden this year, that's really not that feasible. So if you need to till the first year, I'm not opposed to that, but you're going to want to apply a little organic matter first. So this is where we start talking about compost. If this is your first year in this garden, it's probably going to be a good idea to get a soils test first, so that you can establish whether you have too high of phosphorus levels. And if you do, you probably not want to be applying things like compost that have animal manures in them. Animal manure-based composts are going to be the ones that have those high phosphorus levels. So if you already have high phosphorus in your soil, you're going to want to avoid those high animal manure-based compost. If you're using compost in your garden, you'll want to apply it at this stage. So after we've removed the leaves and we're going to put the compost down. I don't use the compost anymore. I find that I don't need it. I also find that, again, it's elevating my phosphorus levels, so I just don't apply it. If you are going to apply it before you work your bed. So apply that compost first. Then you can go in with a broadfork. A broadfork is a great tool. And even if you till, you can use a broadfork too, because it gets a little bit deeper into the soil. So I like to do the broadfork. You just stick it into the soil. You pull it back until the soil just cracks, not until you fully turn it over, just to crack stage. And then some of that compost will kind of work its way down and into the soil profile, and it helps to aerate it a little bit without totally turning everything over and decimating all the aggregation in there. So we're gonna go through, we're gonna broadfork the whole thing. Next, we're gonna put down our cover crop seeds. So I like to either use my broadfork, I'll flip it around and then drag it across the soil, or you can use a pickaxe. So out here you can see I'm just using a pickaxe to draw some furrows in the ground. And then I'm sprinkling my peas and oats in. Now, because I'm hoping to get some nitrogen fixation from my peas, I'm going to make sure I inoculate with rhizobia first. I'm gonna link the video where we show this detailed how to inoculate your seeds at the end of this video. But for now, what you need to know is that if you're planting a legume like peas or alfalfa or hairy vetch or fava beans that fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere, puts it into the roots, you need to inoculate those seeds with the correct rhizobia. That's sometimes present in your soil, but not always. So I usually recommend inoculating. You just rub it all over the seeds, and then that's the rhizobia that it needs to help fixate nitrogen. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you might get the organic matter and the growth of the plant, but not the nitrogen. You can also throw a scoop of handmade compost in there if you have it, just to help bring up the microbiome of those seeds. And then we're gonna sprinkle them all over where we've just created our furrows. Go through with the rake and rake it in just to cover, and now those leaves come back into play. So if you don't have leaves, you could use another mulch. Pine needles work really well. I wouldn't use wood mulches just because it's gonna take too long to break down in an annual bed. Leaves are a great one. I'm gonna sprinkle my leaves that I set aside, and I'm gonna sprinkle them back over after I put my cover crop seed down. That's gonna help keep the moisture in the soil while these seeds are germinating, especially because early spring, I'm usually not watering yet. I usually don't have my water on until April, May. And right now we're still about 8 weeks before our last frost. So I don't have my water on yet. So putting those leaves and that mulch down on top helps to keep the moisture in the soil. And then we wait. Once we get our growth on our cover crop, usually for me, this means right around last frost, maybe a little bit later is when we're gonna come through and terminate it. Now, this is why I like using peas and oats, because we can cut them down to terminate. Peas, we can do it pretty much at any stage. Oats, it's best to do it if they're at milk stage. So that's when we take a grain of the oats, squeeze it, and a little bit of milky sap comes out. That's what's called milk stage. So if we cut it at that stage, it will kill the oats. If it's not at that stage yet, it might regrow. So if you're wanting to plant right at last frost and you're doing this cover crop in the spring, then you may want to omit the oats and just do peas. The peas will be easier for you to terminate if it's your first time cover cropping. Now, if it's fall, the other time I like to recommend doing this is in the fall. So say you've grown some early plants like radishes, peas, sweet peas, snapdragons, things that do really, really well when it's cooler, but then tend to fizzle out toward the end of the season. That's where you can do a late summer fall cover crop. So that's when it's great because you can use something that's going to winter kill with ground freeze or with frost. Peas will winter kill in my zone. I'm zone 5, 6. Oats will kill in my zone in the winter. Anywhere if your ground freezes, those things are going to winter kill. So that's great because I can plant them in late summer, let them grow, and then they just die off on their own. And in the spring, I can go ahead and plant right into that debris. The same thing in the spring. If I planted my cover crop in the spring, after I've gone through and cut it all down, I'm just using a weed whacker to cut it right down at the root. And I can plant right into that about a week after I've terminated that crop. Just leave all the debris right on top of the soil, let it break down into organic matter. It's got a pretty low C to N carbon to nitrogen ratio, so it's gonna break down pretty quickly, and you'll be left with better organic matter, that organic matter that has really reached down into the soil. So those cover crops are helping to fix our clay soil and our sandy soil because it's really working the organic matter into the soil. It's breaking it up using plant roots, and at the same time, it has an advantage over compost in that it's bringing in more soil life because the soil life really wants those plant roots. It wants that rhizophagy cycle. It wants the interaction with the exudates of the plant roots. That's going to attract the earthworms to your soil. That's going to get your soil healthier much faster using roots versus just using compost. Now I know cover cropping, everybody hears this word and they panic. Cover cropping tends to freak people out, and I get that because we hear cropping and we think farming and we think I can't do that, I don't have a tractor, I don't have all these things. You don't have to have all of that stuff. We cover crop by hand. I cover crop my garden beds. Even the areas that I don't use for production on the farm, I cover crop because it's so good for the soil. If we're looking at the soil food web, the base rung of that soil food web really are the plant roots. The plant roots provide root exudates. They provide sugars and things to feed the microbiome, the rhizosphere around the root area. So the fungi, the bacteria will feed off of that, and in turn, they feed the plants. There's actually rhizophagy happening where the plant roots are actually consuming, they're absorbing bacteria from the soil and converting that into nitrogen. This is really cool stuff. It's also why adding molasses to your soil works well, because it boosts the microbial population, the bacteria, and that bacteria can actually be converted into nitrogen by your plants. But anyway, that's a whole nother discussion for a different day. So what we need to know is that by having plant roots in the soil, that's going to help keep our soil food web active and alive and thriving for much longer. You can do this in the spring or you can do it in the fall. When you are just getting into cover cropping, I typically recommend sticking with 1 or 2 species and sticking with 1 or 2 species that like to be terminated the same way. So when we're thinking about cover cropping, we always want to think about the end point, that is termination or killing the cover crop, because we have to kill it before it sets seed. If we let it set seed, we can get a mess on our hands, and also we can lose some of the benefits of that cover crop. So for example, a nitrogen fixing cover crop, yes, it takes nitrogen from the atmosphere, fixes it down into the plant roots, but if we let that plant then go to seed, so peas, for example, if we let them make peas, all of that nitrogen in the roots has gone into making the peas, and then we lose that nitrogen from the soil profile. If we're doing it to get things like nitrogen benefits, we have to terminate our cover crop before it sets seed. So we always want to be thinking of that end goal when we're planting our cover crop. How can we terminate it? What's the recommended way to terminate this cover crop? Is that going to be something that I can do, that I have the equipment to be able to do? Crimping on a home scale, I will often just grab the roots and break them with my hands. You're just basically trying to just bend the root to at least a 90-degree angle so that the plant juices can't get up into the top of the plant. Now this has to be done at the right stage. It has to be usually done at flowering stage. So if you're going to be using crimping, you have to bear that in mind. Now you can also use mowing or cutting. I usually use a weed whacker. This is a great way to do it on a home scale. There's also things like tarping. I don't love using plastic in the garden, you guys know that, so I tend to shy away from using plastic to solarize, but you can do that if you get into a bind. You can also till in a cover crop. Now, of course, I don't recommend doing that every year, maybe once every 5 years at most, because tilling is not great for your soil health. It's not great for the aggregation. It's not great for those microbes and fungi and arthropods and worms and stuff that are in your soil that we want to keep happy. You do need to know going into it how you're going to kill your cover crop at the end. So I like to use ones that I know will either winter kill if I'm planting it in the fall, or ones that I can cut down if I'm planting it in the spring. So for me, those are things like peas and oats. and buckwheat work really well. Again, I'm going to tell you that if you're going to get into cover cropping, I recommend you start with 1 or 2 species at a time. Don't get crazy with 16 different ones at once because they often have lots of different termination requirements and that can get complicated. And also don't go with one that's traditionally hard to terminate. So ones like rye or hairy vetch kind of are known to be a little bit trickier. They can be difficult to terminate. So I wouldn't use one like that or a grass if you're just getting started down this road of cover cropping. So this is why I'm recommending peas and oats to you today, because it's a pretty good, easy to terminate mix. Even if you don't catch it in time and it goes to seed, it's not going to create a big, huge, messy, weedy mess in your garden bed. I hope that explains your questions. I know that sometimes I talk a little fast. It's because I get excited about soil, and I'm sorry about that. If you need to go back and take some notes, please do. Otherwise, ask me any questions you have about this below, and hopefully I can answer them. If you like this video, remember to like and subscribe and all that good stuff. It really means a lot to us here at the farm, and I hope that you're inspired to maybe do a little cover cropping this year and fix up that soil that you already have. All right, we'll see you guys around here soon at the farm.